Economists have downgraded their forecast for the Eurozone economy as a fresh wave of lockdown measures come into force across the continent. They expect the economy to shrink by 2.3% in the fourth quarter of this year. That is worse than previously predicted before tighter restrictions were announced. The bloc had rebounded from its recession following the spring lockdown, with a record quarterly GDP growth of 12.7% in the 3 months to September. But the output was still well below pre-pandemic levels. Well, let's find out more. We're joined by senior Eurozone economist Bert Colijn from Amsterdam. Thank you very much for speaking to us. This was inevitable, wasn't it, a little bit, that with increased restrictions, new lockdowns in place, there was going to be a slump in the fourth quarter. Is it going to be as bad as perhaps predicted?
It does look like it's going to be in that range that you just suggested. Around 2% of a decline is definitely not unimaginable. We're looking at parts of the economy being completely shut down, some countries shutting down non-essential retail. That is just something that the economy is, of course, super sensitive to, and you're going to see an immediate shock to the economy because of that.
We've got lots on non-essential retail, particularly in France, coming up a little bit in the programme. Just tell us, what can countries do, what can authorities do to try and prevent those economies shrinking while these secondary lockdown periods are in place?
It's very difficult to prevent the shrinking itself, but what we've seen from the first lockdown is that the government response was actually was quite decent. I mean, and that's actually what the third quarter GDP numbers that you just mentioned, 12.7% growth for the Eurozone as a whole, is a massive bounce back, and that's more or less, or a large part of that is because the stabilization that fiscal policy has managed to achieve. So I think that we got it somewhat right. You need to compensate businesses that are experiencing a fallout with no turnover whatsoever for the lockdown period. And what's helped very much is that furlough schemes have helped people retain jobs and therefore stabilized income, so that once the economy reopens again, you see a bounce back in terms of sales. And that's actually what happened the first time around. Retail sales had recovered to a level higher than what we saw prior to the crisis after the first lockdown, as people were sort of catching up in terms of buying. And that's definitely in part because of the schemes that were in place.
How sustainable is that stabilisation, though? Because people that we've spoken to on this programme, epidemiologists, for example, they predict we could just be in a rolling sort of situation when we're going from lockdown to lifting lockdown to lockdown again. You know, how sustainable is that to keep things in a position where when we come out of lockdown, the economy bounces back again?
And that's very difficult to predict, and I'm sure that virologists, epidemiologists know that much better than me. But the uncertainty that we have for our outlook for 2021 is therefore also incredible, with upsides to it, which is if a vaccine comes into place that is very effective, combined with testing, for example. You could see that we were perhaps to be able to move out of a situation of moving up and down permanently. On the other hand, the scenario that you are sketching there is realistic and is something that we're also definitely keeping into account.
Thank you very much for speaking to us. Senior Eurozone economist Bert Colijn from Amsterdam.